Kawaki is going to lose his karma marking. Or at least, he might. See, it's absolutely no secret that when it comes down to power, Kawaki is 100% dependent on the power of his karma marking. A karma marking that allows for him to tap into all of the abilities of the now dead and gone Ishiki. Whether that be opening and controlling the Daikokuten, a timeless pocket dimension that he owns, or controlling the shape of not only himself, but also any inanimate objects he comes into contact with, Kawaki has learned how to leverage the powers of his karma marking to an insane degree. And it's all thanks to Amado, who was able to, after Ishiki's passing, re-implant Kawaki with the karma marking, devoid of Ishiki's soul, but very much filled with his powers. But for some reason, all of us Boruto readers have assumed that this karma marking placed on Kawaki by Amado, the first time he's ever done anything like this, is 100% perfect. A karma marking placed with absolutely no drawbacks, no lifespan, just raw, unfiltered power with no strings attached. And while some of you might be saying right now, well, Nick, there is strings attached. I mean, after all, the only reason that Amado did it in the first place is so that Kawaki could place a karma marking on the clone of Akebi that Amado made, thus bringing Akebi back to life. Those aren't the strings that I'm talking about today. See, because, well, yes, Amado 100% has ulterior motives for placing a karma marking on Kawaki in the first place, and therefore Amado had a lot of fear about the idea that one day somehow Kawaki would die, therefore being unable to place a karma marking on the Akebi clone he created and bring his daughter back to life. Today, rather than talking about the ulterior motives of Amado, I want to talk about how the fear he has surrounding Kawaki and his karma marking may actually be justified. Because while I don't believe Kawaki is dying anytime soon, I believe there is a fairly good chance that Kawaki's karma marking could go from black to white, rendering Amado's hopes and dreams of bringing his daughter back to life obsolete, which could possibly lead to Amado once and for all revealing his true nature to humanity, as he no longer believes there's any reason for them to keep on living. If his daughter can't be alive, well then maybe no one else deserves to live. But what is the basis for all of these claims? How could Kawaki's karma marking possibly go from black to white, and what would that have to do with Amado and Akebi? Well, we're going to be talking about all that and a whole lot more, because today we're talking Kawaki lost his karma mark. But before we get to talking on anything, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you guys are looking for one additional NC Hammer 23 video a week, guys, you can go ahead and find my Naruto reaction series using the fourth wall link in my description below. Sasuke just got his magical hickey, and things are getting real wild in the Forest of Death. But before we get into all that, today we gotta talk about our favorite recurring sponsor to the page, Holzkern. Holzkern is a family business founded in Vienna, Austria in 2016 that specializes in watches and jewelry made from natural materials for both women and men. All of their products are made from natural materials to ensure that each product is not only unique but also high quality. And all of the products are made in small batches to ensure responsible and ethical production. Not to mention they also offer worldwide shipping from Vienna, ensuring that regardless of where you are, orders show up in just 5 to 9 days. And if you're in the United States like me, don't worry, they've already handled all of that tariff nonsense behind the scenes, so no hike in prices here. So whether you're looking for products that feature natural materials like freshwater pearls, leaves, stones, gemstones, or even wood, or just looking for an ethical and responsible way to shop for some high-end watches, jewelry, and accessories for both men and women, Holzkern is your one-stop shopping website. So use my promo code displayed on screen right now at checkout, or click the link in my description for 15% off your Holzkern order today. It's time we start looking as good as we feel. So, as we all know, Kawaki has gone through 2 separate karma markings. Initially, Kawaki had a karma marking placed on him through the combined effort of Amado and Jigen. Kawaki was the only out of possibly hundreds of kids tested that was able to find affinity with Ishiki's karma marking to a level that he was able to manifest a black karma marking. Meaning that when Kawaki's karma marking reached 100% expression and he became a full-blooded Otsutsuki, Ishiki would be able to shed Jigen as a vessel and use Kawaki as a reincarnation vessel, deleting the existence of Kawaki and simply turning him into Ishiki. However, because Jigen in a weakened state was forced into a battle against Kashin Koji that he could not win, Ishiki actually had to use Jigen as his reincarnation vessel. And while an Otsutsuki is able to have several different karma markings on several different people, the second that an Otsutsuki chooses to reincarnate in one of those vessels, all of the other karma markings disappear. And thus, while Kawaki was never going to be used as a vessel for Ishiki's reincarnation, he lost basically all of the power that he had gained over the course of the years that he had his karma marking, because when Ishiki reincarnated using Jigen, Kawaki's karma marking disappeared. Now, after Ishiki was long dead and gone, Amado reverse engineered this karma marking and put it once again back on Kawaki, with apparently no strings attached. Just the raw, uncut powers of Ishiki without Ishiki's soul. However, it was later revealed that Amado actually placed the DNA and chakra of Akebi, his long-lost daughter, into Kawaki's karma marking, so that Kawaki could place a karma marking on somebody, preferably Akebi's clone, to bring Akebi back to life in a new vessel. And this is actually most likely why Kawaki's new karma marking is black instead of white. See, it would stand to reason, since Ishiki's soul is no longer tied to Kawaki's karma marking, that he should have a white karma marking, like Code, as after all, Code supposedly has access to all of the power of Ishiki, but couldn't be used as a reincarnation vessel. But logically, Kawaki having a black karma marking and being a full-fledged Otsutsuki kind of raises a couple of questions. See, if Kawaki is a full-fledged Otsutsuki, that means that his karma marking has 100% expressed, except it hasn't, and he's actually technically not 100% Otsutsuki like Boruto. See, the expression of Kawaki's karma marking actually was halted at 80%. And this is why Ishiki was never able to use Kawaki as a reincarnation vessel, because he never hit 100% expression, which means that Kawaki only underwent about 80% otutsification before Ishiki's death. But what does this mean? Does this mean that he's now 20% Akebi, 80% Ishiki? Well, that raises a logical question and a couple of logical answers. See, because one would assume that if Kawaki were to reach full otutsification, that he would naturally turn into whoever's chakra and DNA he had filtered into his karma. However, since Kawaki was only able to achieve 80% otutsification while holding onto the karma marking of Ishiki, he never underwent that process for Ishiki, and now he has an 80% otutsified body and a new artificial karma placed on that body. However, supposedly, Akebi is not an Otsutsuki, and therefore, in order to reincarnate into somebody's body, she wouldn't really need a 100% Otsutsified body to pop into, which is why supposedly her clone will work. But this could also explain why Kawaki's been able to spend 3 years with this artificial karma marking and not just turn into Akebi. And all of this is assuming that the karma marking is even progressing in the first place. See, ironically, the placement of Akebi's chakra and DNA into Kawaki's artificial karma marking may actually have the opposite effect of holding on to Ishiki's karma marking. See, because if the purpose of a karma marking is to prepare a vessel for reincarnation of the person whose chakra and DNA is inside that karma marking, and therefore a non-Otsutsuki body is Otsutsified in order to prepare for a Otsutsuki reincarnation, wouldn't it make sense that if a human was trying to undergo reincarnation in that vessel, that it would turn that body into a more human body? And thus, there's this prevailing idea in the Boruto community that one of the reasons that Kawaki is so much weaker than Boruto was not only because of the limiters placed on him by Amado, but also possibly because Akebi's DNA and chakra is actually de-otsutsifying Kawaki. But all of this is assuming that Akebi's DNA is actually being loaded up into Kawaki in the first place, which seems relatively unlikely considering the fact that Amado is trying to get Kawaki to place a karma marking on Akebi's clone, but it's not an insane hypothesis. See, the number one most important thing to Amado is getting Akebi back. As to how that's achieved, well, it doesn't really matter. Well, yes, the absolute best case scenario would be for Kawaki to place a karma marking on the Akebi clone and have that karma marking expressed on the Akebi clone, slowly but surely bringing Akebi back to life. However, kind of like how we've all pointed out the fact that Madara's plan for the Eye of the Moon was completely asinine, Amado fully understood while placing this karma marking on Kawaki that Kawaki despised the Otsutsuki, and Amado knew better than anybody else that Kawaki is a deeply unstable individual. And thus, kind of like how it was insane that Madara staked his entire plan for the Eye of the Moon, not only Obito being loyal to him after his death, but also Obito being able to recruit Nagato to their cause so convincingly that Nagato gives up his life to bring Madara back to life. It would be kind of crazy for Amado to stake his entire plan for bringing his daughter back to life on the idea that Kawaki would help him, especially when you consider the fact that there is a fair to decent chance that when Kawaki places this karma marking on Akebi, once that karma marking fully expresses and Akebi becomes, well, Akebi, Kawaki will lose his karma marking again.
Wait, what? What are we talking about here, Nick?
Yeah, well, Kawaki's karma marking may be devoid of Ishiki, it's not devoid of Akebi. White karma markings do not disappear when the original karma placer passes away. This is why Code still has his white karma marking even though Ishiki is dead and gone. However, black karma markings do. And as Kawaki is a wielder of a black Kama marking that holds on to the chakra and DNA of Akebi, if Akebi were to re-manifest in a different reincarnation vessel, aka her clone, it stands to reason that there's a fair to good chance that Kawaki would lose his Kama marking for a second time. And if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense for Amado. Listen, we are all sus on Amado, and most people believe that Amado has some kind of nefarious connection to the Otsutsuki. That either being that Akebi is actually Shibai and Amado is his lower ranked Otsutsuki, or I guess in the case of Akebi being Shibai, her lower ranking Otsutsuki, or that somehow, some way, Amado actually worships the Otsutsuki, even though he was instrumental in the defeat of Jigen and Ishiki. Regardless, if our feelings about Amado actually being sus are correct, this would mean that when Akebi is brought back to life and possibly revealed to be an Otsutsuki, she would immediately be identified as a threat by Kawaki, and thus Kawaki would kill her. At least if he could. And this has been set up by Kawaki. He's told Amado that if Akebi is even remotely Otsutsuki, he would kill her right then and there on the spot. Now, there's not really any way for Kawaki to identify that Akebi is Otsutsuki unless he's somehow, some way able to sense her chakra and identify it as inherently Otsutsuki. Something that could possibly happen based off everything we've seen from Boruto. However, if you're Amado and you're trying to bring Akebi back to life, and you understand that maybe she is an Otsutsuki or she could be misinterpreted as an Otsutsuki, and you know that Kawaki will kill the daughter that you fought for decades to bring back to life the second that he believes that she is an Otsutsuki, wouldn't it make sense to set up some kind of failsafe that ensures that he can't do that? And well, what better for a failsafe than simply stripping Kawaki of his powers? See, because we've seen Kawaki try to fight without his Kama marking before, when he was completely and totally embarrassed by Boroshiki. And thus if Akebi actually was an Otsutsuki, and therefore is in danger from the threat of Kawaki, the only way to neutralize that threat would be to make sure that Kawaki's Kama marking is, well, no longer. But Nick, wouldn't that make Kawaki pretty much irrelevant in terms of the power scheme of Boruto? Yeah, pretty instantaneously. But here's the thing. It takes a little while for a Kama marking to fully express, and thus even after Kawaki placed his Kama marking on the clone of Akebi, it would still take a little while for her to be able to fully reincarnate. And that's where I believe this last chapter, chapter 24 of Two Blue Vortex, comes in with a pretty insane piece of foreshadowing. See, because let's assume that Amado's plan is either for Kawaki to place a Kama marking on the Akebi clone, and for that Akebi clone to fully express that Kama marking, stealing the Kama marking from Kawaki, or in a much more nefarious and deadly result for Kawaki, should he decide that he's not going to place that Kama marking on the Akebi clone, Amado would simply wait for Akebi's Kama marking to 100% express on Kawaki, turning Kawaki into a potential reincarnation vessel for Akebi, which could 100% happen. There's really no gender constraints that say Kawaki can't turn into Akebi. I mean, Jigen turned into Ishiki, and Ishiki was planning on turning Kawaki into Ishiki, and like, well, yeah, all of them were men. I seriously doubt gender has anything to do with it. Anyways, well then what we see in chapter 24 from Kawaki mid his fight against Jura becomes so vastly important. See, because on page 14 of chapter 24 of Two Blue Vortex, we see Kawaki jamming his chakra rod into Jura's chest. And after jamming his chakra rod into Jura's chest, we see that Kawaki's Kama marking begins to go white. Like the color of his Kama marking is fading from his knuckles down to his forearm. And that by fading the color of his Kama marking, possibly into that of his chakra rod, Kawaki is able to make the end of his rod explode into Jura's chest, leaving a grievous and gaping wound. Now, Kawaki controlling lasers and explosives is nothing new. Multiple times we've seen Kawaki create lasers and explosives so incredibly devastating that they can terraform entire battlefields. And in fact, later in this very chapter, on page 23, we see Kawaki powering up one of his iconic borderline Kamehamehas that creates an explosion so large that it dwarfs him. And as Kawaki begins to power up this explosion, we actually see from the palm side of his Kama marking that his Kama marking is beginning to lighten. See, because in a black and white medium like manga, the only way to show that something is lighting up is to make it white. However, rather interestingly, as Kawaki begins to power up this explosion that's much more powerful than the one that he used against Jura through the medium of his chakra rod, the shading on his Kama marking is still substantially darker. While in this panel you can tell that Ikemoto is trying to depict the Kama marking glowing, on page 14 the Kama marking seems to be doing something very different from glowing. Because while this is not the first time that Kawaki's Kama marking has taken on a white-like appearance to charge up some kind of explosive attack, the appearance of this glowing Kama marking is usually much closer to what we see on page 23 as opposed to page 14. A cell-shaded Kama marking as opposed to an all-black one. But on page 14 we don't see cell shading. We see pure white. Now, the question to be asked here is this pure white we're seeing on Kawaki's left hand an indicator of increased power, or the possible loss of the karma marking? Because, like I said, while we have seen previously in the manga Kawaki's karma marking glow, most notably in his battle against Garo in chapter 25, I believe, of part 1, and we even see the stylistic karma marking glow a little bit later in this very same chapter, chapter 24 of Two Blue Vortex, the karma marking has never glowed this white before, and thus while this extra fluorescence could simply show off this newfound strength that Kawaki has now that his limiters have been taken off, never before has such special attention been paid to this glowing effect of the karma marking. So what if, rather than simply depicting how powerful Kawaki is now, this moment is actually showing us one of the key reasons that Amado was so reserved in the idea of lifting Kawaki's limiters? See, because like the explanation or not, the idea that Amado would limit the offensive capabilities of Kawaki to ensure that he doesn't die just doesn't make that much sense. Yes, Amado wants to keep Kawaki alive, and therefore he maxed out his defensive and regenerative abilities. But doesn't Kawaki stand a much better chance to stay alive if he can win the fights that he enters? It's not like Kawaki was so weak with his limiters on that he wouldn't fly into combat if given the opportunity. And it's also not like Kawaki was the kind of person to be discouraged from entering combat just because he was beaten before, especially when you consider the fact that in any and all combat, regardless of how bad it went for Kawaki, he was rarely seriously injured and was able to recover from even the smallest of injuries that he got almost immediately. And thus, if Amado wanted to ensure that Kawaki stood the best chance of staying alive that he possibly could, why not max out all his stats?
Well, then Kawaki's a threat to Amado, Nick.
Well, not really. Kawaki has a built-in off switch by Amado, and while maybe Amado has a lessened chance of flipping that off switch off if Kawaki is even more powerful than he was with his limiters on, the risk of that feels negligible, especially when compared to the risk of Kawaki going into battle against incredibly strong foes without all of the offensive capability he possibly could have. And thus, what if in actuality the real reason that Amado limited the power of Kawaki was because he understood that the karma marking he placed on Kawaki could not handle the full power of Ishiki. And thus now that Kawaki is flying around, tapping into the full power of Ishiki and going toe-to-toe with Shinju like Jura, that power level puts a strain on the possibly human chakra and DNA of Akebi, slowly but surely degrading the chakra of Akebi as it tries to hold on for dear life as Kawaki uses 120% of his potential. But ironically, if this is the case, it would kind of work out perfectly for Kawaki, because while the idea that Kawaki's karma marking was slowly but surely going white would put a ton of pressure on Amado to try and get Akebi brought back to life as soon as possible. This would mean that after Akebi's karma marking was fully expressed on the Akebi clone's body, if by that time Kawaki's karma marking had gone completely white, when that karma marking fully expressed on the Akebi clone's body and she just became Akebi again, Kawaki would not lose his karma marking. And thus, not only does this serve as the perfect way to bring Akebi back to life as the possible endgame villain of Two Blue Vortex, but also it ensures that when that happens, Kawaki will not be taken out of the relevant power scheme and therefore will be available to fight against her, assuming that she is the endgame villain. But even if she isn't the endgame villain, this would still mean that whenever Akebi is fully reincarnated and Amado is given the ending that he was looking for, Kawaki isn't stripped of his power and therefore stripped of his usefulness. However, I do believe that there is a fair to good chance that Boruto's story does end with Kawaki being karmaless, as Kawaki's dependence on the power of the karma is inherently very non-ninja-like, something that not only the manga has gotten into somewhat briefly, but also the anime has gotten into in a very, very detailed way. And thus, in a world where Kawaki no longer has access to his karma marking, in order to remain a relevant ninja, he would have to train like every other ninja, like Boruto has been begging him to do since the beginning of the time skip. But then again, what do I know? Do you guys believe there's a possibility that Kawaki loses his karma marking, or maybe that even his karma marking will turn white? Let me know in the comments below. And while you guys are down there, please, from me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have to go get a haircut. This is getting way too long.